Daniel Brooks woke up before the alarm most mornings. Not because he wanted to, but because his body never quite trusted sleep anymore. It was always listening for something, an unfamiliar sound, a cry from the next room, the faint hum of the heater cutting out in the middle of an Ohio winter night. The house was quiet. Too quiet, the kind that pressed against his ears. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan above him, counting the rotations until the tightness in his chest eased. Then he swung his legs off the couch, his bed for the last 3 years, and stood carefully, already moving like someone who didn't want to wake the world. In the small kitchen, the floor was cold through his socks. Daniel filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and leaned against the counter while it heated. The clock on the microwave blinked 5:12 a.m. He was ahead of schedule. That almost never happened. From the hallway came the soft, uneven breathing of his son. Caleb slept with his door cracked open, a habit that started after the hospital days and never went away. Daniel passed by quietly, pausing just long enough to see the shape of the boy curled under his blanket, one arm flung out like he was holding on to something invisible. 5 more minutes, Daniel murmured to himself, not to Caleb. The kettle whistled. Breakfast followed the same rhythm every morning. Toast slightly darker than necessary, eggs scrambled just until they were firm, apples sliced thin so Caleb wouldn't complain. Daniel packed lunch with mechanical precision. He did it this way because thinking too much made the quiet louder. By the time Caleb shuffled into the kitchen, hair sticking up in the back, Daniel was already tying his tie for work. "You're up early," Caleb said, rubbing his eyes. "You say that every day," Daniel replied. Caleb grinned. Still true. They ate at the small table by the window. Outside, the streetlights glowed weakly against a sky that hadn't decided what color it wanted to be yet. Snow from the night before clung to the curb in uneven piles. "Bus comes in 10, Daniel said. Caleb nodded, mouth full. "I have science today." "You say that like it's a threat." "It is," Caleb said seriously. "We're doing presentations." Daniel smiled despite himself. "You'll be fine." They walked to the bus stop together, breath fogging in the cold. Daniel listened to Caleb talk about planets, facts he'd memorized and facts he'd invented, all blended together. Daniel didn't correct him. He just nodded, hands shoved into his coat pockets, wishing for the 1,000th time that time could slow down. When the bus arrived, Caleb climbed aboard and turned to wave. Daniel waved back until the doors closed and the bus pulled away. Only then did he let his shoulders drop. At work, Daniel was exactly who people expected him to be. On time. Quiet. Reliable. He worked at Hawthorne Logistics, a distribution company that ran on schedules, numbers, and people who didn't ask too many questions. Daniel fit perfectly. Most days no one noticed him, and that was fine. He preferred the warehouse floor to the offices upstairs. The steady beep of scanners. The rumble of forklifts. The smell of cardboard and diesel. It was honest work. You did your part, things moved where they were supposed to go. During breaks, other employees talked about weekend plans, holiday parties, overtime bonuses. Daniel scrolled through photos on his phone, old ones mostly. He never stayed on them long. There was a Christmas flyer taped to the bulletin board near the time clock. Red and green. Snowflakes. Mandatory attendance encouraged. Daniel read it once, then again, as if the words might change. A party meant late hours. Babysitters. Awkward conversations. People asking questions he didn't want to answer. He folded the flyer into his pocket instead of throwing it away. By the end of the shift, his feet ached and his shoulders felt tight, but the thought of home pulled him forward. Dinner. Homework. The familiar comfort of routine. Still, as he drove away from the warehouse, the flyer sat heavy in his pocket, like a decision waiting to be made. If you've ever known someone like Daniel, or maybe you are someone like him, you already know this kind of quiet doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is happening under the surface. And sometimes all it takes is one ordinary night, one small decision to crack it open. If you're listening to this and it feels familiar, you're not alone. Stories like this unfold every day unnoticed. And if you want to stay with Daniel and see where his path leads, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. That night after Caleb fell asleep, Daniel pulled the flyer from his coat and read it one more time. He didn't know it yet, but the choice he was about to make would quietly undo the life he'd worked so hard to keep contained. Daniel had learned that nights were harder than mornings. Mornings demanded action. There was no room for memory when you were scrambling eggs and finding missing socks. Nights, though, stretched. They invited thoughts to sit down and get comfortable. After Caleb fell asleep, Daniel moved through the house, turning off lights that didn't need to be on. He paused outside the bedroom that used to be his, the door shut tight. He hadn't opened it in months. He told himself it was practical. Less space to heat, less to clean, but the truth was heavier than that. The couch creaked when he sat. Same spot. Same blanket pulled up to his chest. He stared at the television without turning it on, listening instead to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a passing car. On the coffee table lay Caleb's science notes. Planets written in crooked pencil. Saturn had rings drawn way too big. Daniel smiled faintly. Tomorrow, he murmured, though no one heard him. Sleep came in pieces. Short, shallow stretches broken by dreams that didn't announce themselves until they were already inside him. Hospital lights. The beeping of machines. Monique's hand in his, warm but weakening. He woke before the alarm again, breath caught in his throat, heart pounding like he'd been running. Daniel sat up slowly, rubbing his face. He waited until the panic eased, until his surroundings felt solid again. Couch. Blanket. Living room. You're here, he told himself. You're okay. He stood and went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, drank it in steady gulps. The flyer slipped out of his pocket when he reached for his phone. It landed face up on the counter. Christmas party. Friday. 7 p.m. Daniel stared at it longer than he meant to. At work the next day the flyer seemed to follow him. People talked about outfits and rides and which managers were most likely to get drunk. Someone joked about karaoke. Daniel laughed when expected, nodded when spoken to, but his mind kept circling the same problem. Mrs. Delgado could watch Caleb. She lived 2 houses down. She liked him. But it was a favor, and Daniel hated owing favors. And even if he figured that out, there was the party itself. Standing around with people who didn't know him. Didn't need to. Near the end of the shift, his supervisor, Ron, caught up with him near the loading bay. You going Friday? Ron asked. Daniel hesitated. I might. Ron raised an eyebrow. Might. Depends, Daniel said carefully. Ron sighed. Look, I know you keep to yourself. But it'd be good for you to show your face. Management notices that stuff. Daniel nodded. He always nodded. I'll see what I can do. That night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, tongue stuck out slightly as he colored in planets. Can Mrs. Delgado come over Friday? Caleb asked suddenly. Daniel paused mid-dish. Why? Caleb shrugged. She said something about cookies. Daniel studied his son's face. Too casual. Too rehearsed. You already talked to her, Daniel said. Caleb grinned. Maybe. Daniel shook his head, a reluctant smile tugging at his mouth. You planning my social life now? Mom would have made you go, Caleb said, not unkindly. The room went quiet. Daniel dried his hands slowly. Yeah, he said. She probably would have. Friday came faster than he expected. By the time Daniel arrived at the banquet hall, the parking lot was half full. Warm light spilled from tall windows, and music drifted through the doors every time someone stepped inside. Daniel sat in his car for a full minute before getting out. Inside, the room buzzed with laughter and overlapping conversations. People looked different here, looser, louder. Daniel spotted faces he recognized but rarely spoke to. He took a soda from the bar and found a spot near the wall. That's when he noticed her. Eleanor Price stood near the center of the room, speaking to a small group. She wore a dark green dress, simple but sharp. Her posture was straight, confident. People leaned in when she talked. Daniel had seen her dozens of times before, but never like this. He told himself to look away. Instead, he watched as she accepted another glass of wine, laughing at something someone said. There was a moment, brief, almost unnoticeable, where her smile slipped. Just for a second. Daniel didn't know why that moment stayed with him. An hour later, as he slipped his coat on, he saw Eleanor sway slightly as she reached for her keys. Daniel stopped walking. The music faded into the background. The room felt suddenly too warm. He could leave. No one would stop him. No one would even notice. Instead, he turned back toward her, heart beating faster with every step, unaware that this small decision was about to pull him into a story he never planned to be part of. Monday morning returned everything to its proper places. The warehouse smelled the same: oil, cardboard, cold air creeping in through the loading doors. The noise settled Daniel almost instantly. Scanners beeped. Pallets scraped. Someone laughed too loudly near the lockers. It was familiar. Predictable. Safe. Daniel clocked in and pulled on his gloves, telling himself that Friday night was already over. A moment. Nothing more. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd left early. He always did. Still, as he walked across the floor, he felt it, the faint awareness of being slightly off balance, like standing on a moving bus. His mind replayed small details without permission. Eleanor's unsteady step. The way the junior manager had hesitated. The sound of keys in her hand. He shoved the thoughts away and focused on work. Boxes moved. Numbers lined up. Time passed. By mid-morning, Daniel had almost convinced himself that nothing had changed. Then the email arrived. Daniel Brooks, please stop by my office when you have a moment. No explanation. Just a name at the bottom. Eleanor Price. Daniel stared at the screen longer than necessary. Around him, the warehouse kept moving. Someone bumped his shoulder and muttered an apology. A forklift passed close enough that he felt the vibration through the concrete. He told himself not to assume anything. He closed the email, finished scanning the pallet in front of him, and logged the count twice to be sure. The walk to the offices felt longer than usual. The air changed as soon as he stepped inside. Quieter, carpeted, faintly scented with coffee and cleaning spray. People glanced up as he passed. Not curious. Just noticing. Eleanor's assistant looked up from her desk. She's ready for you. Daniel nodded and knocked once before opening the door. Eleanor stood by the window looking out over the parking lot. She turned when she heard him enter. Daniel. Thank you for coming. Her voice was steady. Professional. If she felt awkward, she didn't show it. You wanted to see me? Daniel said. Yes. Please sit. He did, folding his hands together to keep them still. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. She returned to her desk, sat down, and placed her hands flat on the surface as if grounding herself. I wanted to address Friday night, she said. Daniel's chest tightened, but he kept his face neutral. Of course. I appreciate what you did, she continued. And I want to be clear about something. She met his eyes. There are no expectations. No assumptions. Nothing beyond gratitude. Daniel exhaled slowly. I didn't expect anything, ma'am. I know, she said. And then quieter, that's why I wanted to say it out loud. The silence that followed felt different from the warehouse silence. Thicker. More deliberate. Eleanor shifted in her chair. I've seen you at the Linden Avenue bus stop. Daniel stiffened before he could stop himself. She noticed immediately. Not in a strange way, she added quickly. I passed through there some mornings. Your son, Caleb, right? Daniel nodded. Yes. He talks a lot, Eleanor said, a hint of a smile touching her mouth. Mostly about space. Daniel couldn't help it. He smiled too. Just a little. He's 8, Daniel said. Science phase. He's lucky, Eleanor replied. Not casually. Not politely. Like it was something she'd thought about. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. The meeting ended as simply as it began. No warnings. No instructions. Eleanor thanked him again and dismissed him with a nod. As Daniel stood to leave, she added, You're good at what you do here. He paused. Thank you. Back on the warehouse floor, Daniel felt exposed in a way he hadn't before. Not threatened, just seen. And being seen, he realized, was more unsettling than being ignored. Over the next few days, small things began to shift. Eleanor visited the floor more often. Not hovering. Just passing through. She asked questions about processes, about efficiency, about minor delays. Sometimes she asked Daniel directly, "Why do you stack these pallets this way? Is there a faster route for outbound deliveries?" Her questions were smart, informed. But she lingered when Daniel answered, listening in a way that made him choose his words carefully. Once she laughed at something he said, a dry comment about scanners that never worked when you needed them most. The sound surprised both of them. Daniel noticed other people noticing. A look held a second too long. A conversation that paused when he walked by. At home, nothing changed. Dinner, homework, bedtime stories. But Daniel felt the pull of two worlds stretching him thin. The one he'd built carefully for survival. And this other one, forming quietly at work, full of things he didn't trust himself to want. Late one afternoon, as Daniel loaded his car, he saw Eleanor across the lot, phone pressed to her ear, her expression tight. She didn't see him. Whatever she was hearing, it wasn't good. Daniel hesitated, keys in hand, watching her shoulders tense as she turned away. He drove home with the image burned into his mind, unaware that the space between observation and involvement was already closing, and that soon simply keeping his head down would no longer be an option. The flyer disappeared from the bulletin board sometime after New Year's, but the Christmas party didn't disappear from Daniel's mind as easily. January settled over Columbus in heavy layers. Gray skies, slush along the sidewalks, the kind of cold that seeped through gloves and made your knuckles ache. Daniel welcomed it. Cold kept people moving. It discouraged lingering conversations. It gave him an excuse to stay wrapped inside his routines. At work, things felt almost normal again. Almost. Eleanor still visited the warehouse floor, but not with the same ease as before. There was a carefulness to her now, a measured distance. When she spoke to Daniel, it was professional, brief, precise. The warmth he'd glimpsed after the party was tucked away, like it had never existed. Daniel told himself that was for the best. He didn't need complications. He didn't need attention. He especially didn't need rumors. He worked, he went home, and he kept his life small enough to manage. But small lives still had cracks. One evening, while Caleb worked on homework at the kitchen table, Daniel stood at the sink washing dishes. The radio murmured low in the background. Some talk show host laughing too loudly at their own joke. "Dad," Caleb said. "Yeah. Do you ever miss parties?" Daniel paused, plate half submerged in soapy water. "What kind of parties?" Caleb shrugged. "Like work once. Or with friends." Daniel considered the question honestly. "I don't think I ever liked them much." Caleb nodded, accepting that. Then quieter, "Mom did." The plate slipped slightly in Daniel's hands. "She did?" he said after a moment. That night, Daniel lay awake longer than usual. His mind drifted, not to the party itself, but to the moment before it. Sitting in his car, debating whether to go inside. How close he'd come to turning around. He wondered, not for the first time, how many decisions in his life had been shaped by exhaustion rather than desire. At work the following week, the atmosphere shifted again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It started with a look from a coworker that lingered too long. A half-joking comment about Daniel moving up in the world. Someone else asked if he was thinking of applying for a supervisor role. Daniel laughed it off, but his stomach tightened. During lunch, he overheard fragments. "She talks to him a lot." "Yeah, noticed that." "Must be nice." He ate quickly and returned to the floor. That afternoon, Ron pulled him aside near the loading dock. "Everything okay?" Ron asked, voice casual but eyes sharp. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Why?" Ron hesitated. "Just, be careful, man." "Careful of what?" Ron shook his head. "You know how people are." Daniel did know. He'd known his whole life. At home, Daniel tried to shake the feeling, but it followed him. He snapped at Caleb for leaving his backpack in the hallway, then apologized immediately. Caleb hugged him without asking why. On Thursday, Eleanor sent out a company-wide email announcing changes to the delivery schedule. Routine stuff. Necessary. Daniel read it once and moved on. But later that day, her assistant stopped him in the hallway. "She needs those pallet numbers by end of day," the assistant said. "Directly." Daniel nodded, though something about the wording made him uneasy. He delivered the numbers himself, knocking lightly before entering Eleanor's office. She looked up from her screen. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't want this bouncing through 3 departments." "No problem." There was a pause. "Sure, Charge." Eleanor broke it first. "How's your son?" Daniel blinked. "He's good. Science presentation went fine." She smiled. "I'm glad." That was it. No follow-up. No invitation to stay. As Daniel turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something on her desk. A manila folder. His name typed neatly on the tab. He told himself it was nothing. Reports passed through offices all the time. Performance reviews. Metrics. Still, the image stayed with him. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Daniel sat on the edge of the couch staring at his phone. No messages. No missed calls. He thought about Monique. About how she'd always said silence wasn't neutral, it was a warning sign. Daniel didn't know what was coming. He only knew that something had shifted again, quietly, without asking his permission. And whatever it was already moving faster than he was ready for. The next week began with rain that froze the moment it hit the ground. Daniel drove carefully, hands tight on the steering wheel, windshield wipers squeaking in protest. Columbus traffic moved slower than usual, everyone cautious, everyone tense. It matched the feeling in his chest. At Hawthorne, the parking lot buzzed with low conversation. People stood in small clusters longer than normal before heading inside, collars turned up, voices lowered. Daniel caught fragments as he passed. "HR's been busy lately." Not surprised, honestly. No one said his name. That didn't make him feel better. Inside, the warehouse felt colder than usual. Or maybe that was just him. Daniel focused on work, letting muscle memory take over. Scan. Lift. Stack. Repeat. The repetition steadied him, but it couldn't fully drown out the awareness that something unseen was moving beneath the surface. Around mid-morning, Eleanor appeared on the floor. She wasn't scheduled to be there. Daniel knew that because he'd memorized the patterns without meaning to. Mondays were office days. Tuesdays were usually meetings off-site. Today was neither. She walked with purpose, clipboard in hand, speaking briefly with a supervisor before moving on. Her expression was neutral, professional, but tighter than usual. When her eyes passed over Daniel, they didn't stop. That stung more than he expected. At lunch, Daniel sat alone in his car, engine off, rain tapping against the roof. He ate slowly, scrolling through photos on his phone without really seeing them. Caleb with missing front teeth. Caleb holding a science ribbon. Caleb asleep on the couch with a book sliding off his chest. Daniel locked the phone and leaned his head back. "This is nothing," he told himself. "You're imagining it." But by the end of the day, he knew he wasn't. As he clocked out, someone he barely knew clapped him on the shoulder. "Hey man," the guy said, grinning. "Must be nice getting all that attention." Daniel stared at him. "What attention?" The guy laughed, hands up. "Relax. Just messing with you." Daniel didn't laugh back. That night, Caleb noticed again. "You're quiet," he said, poking at his mashed potatoes. "I'm fine." Caleb looked unconvinced. "You say that when you're not fine." Daniel sighed. "Work stuff. Bad work stuff." Daniel considered lying, then shook his head. "Just complicated." Caleb nodded as if that explained everything. Mom used to say complicated usually means people aren't talking enough. Daniel swallowed. After dinner, while Caleb showered, Daniel stood by the window watching the rain turn to sleet. He thought about the folder on Eleanor's desk. About Ron's warning. About the way people's voices dropped when he walked by. The next morning the email arrived. "Daniel Brooks, please report to Human Resources at 10 a.m. No greeting. No signature beyond the department name. Daniel stared at the screen until the letters blurred. By the time 10 o'clock came, his mouth was dry and his pulse thudded in his ears. He washed his hands in the bathroom, stared at his reflection. He looked the same. Tired maybe. Older than he felt. HR was on the second floor, tucked away from the noise of the warehouse. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The door was already open. Inside sat an HR representative Daniel recognized but didn't know well. And beside her, Eleanor. She didn't look at him right away. Please have a seat, the HR woman said. Daniel sat slowly, hands folded in his lap. The HR representative cleared her throat. We're conducting a formal inquiry regarding a complaint that was submitted last week. Daniel's chest tightened. A complaint about what? She glanced at Eleanor, then back at him. Allegations of inappropriate conduct and perceived favoritism. Daniel felt heat rise to his face. Nothing like that happened. Eleanor finally looked at him. Her expression wasn't cold. It was conflicted. Heavy. I want to be clear, the HR woman continued. This is an investigation. No conclusions have been drawn. Daniel nodded numbly. As the questions began, measured, careful, impersonal, Daniel realized something terrifying. This wasn't about what had happened. It was about how it looked. And once appearances took control of the story, truth became just another voice in the room. When the meeting ended, Daniel walked out into the hallway on unsteady legs, knowing with sudden clarity that his life at Hawthorne, and the quiet stability he'd built for his son, was no longer fully in his hands. The days after the HR meeting moved strangely, like time had lost its usual rhythm. Daniel returned to the warehouse floor with the same badge, the same gloves, the same responsibilities. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, everything felt different. Conversations paused when he approached. Laughter softened. People looked away a beat too late. No one accused him out loud. That was the worst part. HR sent a follow-up email outlining the investigation process. Interviews. Confidentiality. A reminder not to discuss the matter with co-workers. The language was calm, neutral, almost kind. It did nothing to ease the tight knot in Daniel's chest. At home he said nothing. Caleb didn't need that weight. Daniel focused harder than ever on routine. Homework at the table, dinner at 6, lights out by 9. He smiled when expected. He listened. He laughed at the right moments. At night, when the house finally went still, the thoughts came rushing back. What if this cost him his job? What if people believed the wrong version of the story? What if Eleanor said something different than he expected? That thought lingered longer than the rest. At work, Eleanor avoided him completely. Not rudely. Not obviously. Just thoroughly. If she needed numbers, her assistant asked. If she had questions, she sent emails copied to multiple departments. During meetings, her gaze slid past him like he wasn't there. Daniel told himself it was necessary. Professional boundaries. Legal caution. Still, the distance hurt more than he wanted to admit. The investigation dragged on. HR interviewed Daniel twice more. Same questions, slightly rearranged. What happened at the party? Did Eleanor initiate contact? Had they met outside work? Daniel answered truthfully every time, voice steady even when his insides weren't. One afternoon, as he returned to his car after a long shift, he found Ron leaning against the hood. Everything okay? Ron asked again. Daniel hesitated. I don't know. Ron sighed. Look, off the record, people talk. HR doesn't like gray areas. I didn't do anything wrong. I know, Ron said. But knowing doesn't always matter. That night, Daniel snapped at Caleb again. This time over something small, a forgotten math worksheet. Caleb's face crumpled, confusion flashing into hurt. I'm sorry, Daniel said immediately, crouching down. That wasn't about you. Caleb studied him, serious. Are you in trouble? Daniel swallowed. No. Not really. Caleb nodded, but Daniel could tell he didn't fully believe him. The following week, Eleanor resigned. The email hit inboxes at 9:17 a.m. It was short, professional, thanking the team for their hard work, wishing everyone continued success. No explanation. Daniel read it 3 times, his heart sinking lower with each pass. By lunchtime, the warehouse buzzed. Did you see that? Didn't expect that. Guess HR found something. Daniel kept his head down, throat tight. He didn't eat. He wanted to ask someone, anyone, what it meant. Instead, he clocked out early and drove home in silence. That night, he stood in the kitchen long after dinner, staring at nothing. Caleb watched him from the table. She's gone, Daniel said finally, though Caleb didn't know who he meant. Caleb frowned. Is that good or bad? Daniel didn't answer. Weeks passed. The investigation closed quietly. No announcement. No apology. Just a return to normal that wasn't normal at all. Daniel stayed. He worked. He did his job well. But something had shifted permanently. Opportunities dried up. Conversations stayed shallow. The sense of safety he'd built so carefully felt thinner now, fragile. He stopped thinking about Eleanor during the day. At night she returned. Then one afternoon, as Daniel finished his shift, the front desk called his name. There's an envelope here for you, the receptionist said. Daniel frowned. From who? She shrugged. No return address. Daniel took it, heart beating faster than it should have. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten. If you're willing, I owe you the truth. Coffee? Daniel stood there, paper trembling slightly in his hands, knowing that whatever came next would either finally give him answers, or reopen wounds he wasn't sure had ever closed. Daniel didn't respond right away. The note sat folded in his jacket pocket for 2 full days, pressing against his ribs every time he moved. He felt it while unloading trucks. Felt it while standing at the stove stirring soup that neither he nor Caleb really wanted. Felt it when he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the house settle. Coffee meant conversation. Conversation meant answers. And answers had a way of rearranging things you'd already forced into place. On the 3rd morning, Daniel found himself typing a reply before he'd fully decided. 1 hour. Public place. The response came less than a minute later. Of course. Thank you. They met at a small cafe on the north side of the city, far from the office and far from the routes Daniel usually took. The place smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon, the kind of neighborhood spot where no one lingered too long and no one asked questions. Daniel arrived early. Habit. He chose a table near the window back to the wall. He ordered black coffee and kept his coat on. When Eleanor walked in, he almost didn't recognize her. No tailored dress. No heels. She wore jeans, a simple sweater, hair pulled back loosely. She hesitated just inside the door, scanning the room like she wasn't sure she belonged there. When she saw him, relief crossed her face, followed quickly by nerves. Daniel, she said softly. Eleanor. She set her bag down and sat across from him, hands wrapped around her cup like she needed the warmth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier than it had in her office, loaded with everything that hadn't been said. I wasn't sure you'd come, she admitted. I wasn't sure I would, Daniel replied. She nodded, accepting that without argument. Thank you anyway. They sipped their coffee. Outside, cars passed slowly over wet pavement. Somewhere behind the counter, a grinder roared, then stopped. I owe you an explanation, Eleanor said finally. For leaving. For how things ended. Daniel held her gaze. Yes. She inhaled, steadying herself. The investigation didn't end the way you think. Daniel felt his shoulders tense. Then how did it end? It didn't, she said quietly. Not really. She explained that the complaint had triggered more than HR interviews. It had forced her into meetings with legal, with executives, with people who didn't care about nuance. Everything she did was suddenly under a microscope. And I realized, she continued, voice low, that if I stayed, I'd spend every day defending myself instead of doing my job. Daniel listened, expression unreadable. I also realized, she added, that the party wasn't an isolated incident. He looked up sharply. What do you mean? Eleanor hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the mug. I've had a problem for a while. Drinking. Not the kind people notice right away. The kind that hides behind professionalism. Daniel said nothing. That night scared me, she went on. Waking up and not fully remembering how I got home. Knowing I could have hurt someone. Or myself. Daniel thought of keys in her hand. Of the way she'd swayed. I took a leave, Eleanor said. Checked myself into treatment. Quietly. Something shifted in Daniel's chest. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition. I resigned because I needed to fix what I could, she finished. Without excuses. The words hung between them. Daniel leaned back slightly, processing. He'd come expecting justification. Or apology. He hadn't expected honesty. "I didn't tell you before," Eleanor said. "Because at the time, everything was tangled. Power. Perception. I didn't want to drag you further into it." Daniel nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." She looked at him, then really looked. "I'm sorry you got caught in it anyway." For a moment, Daniel considered standing up. Ending it there. He'd gotten some answers. Enough to close the door again. Instead he asked, "Why now?" Eleanor's mouth curved into a small, sad smile. "Because you deserve the truth. And because I'm learning not to disappear when things get uncomfortable." Daniel absorbed that. He respected it more than he wanted to admit. They talked longer than planned. Not about work. About books. About bad coffee. About the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people all day and still feeling unseen. When Daniel mentioned Caleb, Eleanor listened without interrupting. When she spoke about her quiet apartment after the divorce, Daniel understood more than he said. An hour passed. Then another. As they stood to leave, Eleanor paused. "There's something else," she said. "Something I didn't tell HR. Or anyone." Daniel's hand stilled on his coat. "What?" he asked. Eleanor's expression shifted. Hesitation, then resolve. "Before I say it," she said, "you need to know it changes how everything looks." Daniel met her eyes, heart beginning to pound. "Then say it," he replied. She opened her mouth. And stopped. Outside, a car horn blared sharply, cutting through the moment. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself. "I should tell you," she said softly. "But not like this. Not rushed." Daniel didn't argue. They walked out together into the cold, unanswered words trailing behind them. Words that Daniel knew with unsettling certainty were about to change far more than just the past. They didn't speak much after that. Daniel walked Eleanor to her car, both of them careful with their distance, like two people standing near a thin sheet of ice. The cold had sharpened by the time they stepped outside. Wind pushed at their coats, carrying the smell of wet pavement and exhaust. Eleanor unlocked her car and paused, one hand on the door handle. "Thank you for listening," she said. Daniel nodded. "Take care of yourself." She hesitated as if she wanted to say more, then slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. Daniel watched her pull away before heading to his own car. The drive home felt longer than usual. His mind replayed the cafe conversation in fragments. Treatment. Resigned on purpose. You deserve the truth. And then the thing she hadn't said. The thing she'd stopped herself from saying. Daniel hated unfinished sentences. They stuck with him. That night, Caleb was already asleep when Daniel got home. Mrs. Delgado had left a container of soup on the counter with a sticky note that said, "You both look tired." Daniel smiled faintly and placed it in the fridge. He sat on the couch, hands folded, staring at the dark television screen. The house felt smaller than usual, the walls closer. Eleanor's voice echoed in his head, calm but careful. "It changes how everything looks." "What does that even mean?" Daniel muttered aloud. He didn't sleep much. Over the next few days, Eleanor stayed quiet. No texts. No emails. Daniel told himself that was good. Necessary. Still, every time his phone buzzed, his chest tightened before relaxing again. At work, the fallout of Eleanor's resignation continued to ripple outward. Meetings were postponed. Decisions were delayed. People speculated openly now that she was gone. Daniel listened without reacting. One afternoon he overheard two supervisors talking near the break room. "Apparently it was messy," one said. "Always is," the other replied. "You never really know people." Daniel walked past without slowing. That night, as he helped Caleb with math homework, his phone buzzed again. This time he didn't ignore it. "Can we talk? I should have finished what I started." Daniel stared at the message. He didn't respond right away. He waited until Caleb was in bed, until the house was quiet, until he was sure he wasn't answering out of impulse. "Tomorrow," he typed. Same place. The cafe was quieter this time. Mid-afternoon lull. Fewer people. Eleanor arrived first, seated near the window. When Daniel walked in, she looked relieved and nervous all at once. "Thank you for coming back," she said. "I didn't come for pleasantries," Daniel replied, not unkindly. "You said there was more." She nodded. "There is." They ordered coffee, barely touched it. Eleanor took a deep breath. The complaint that triggered the investigation, it wasn't random. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I figured. It was filed by my ex-husband." The words landed heavier than Daniel expected. "He works for one of our partner firms," Eleanor continued. "He'd been trying to regain leverage since the divorce. When he saw an opportunity, he took it." Daniel leaned back slowly, anger rising hot and sudden. "So he made it look like—" "Yes," Eleanor said. "And once HR got involved, it stopped being about truth." Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. "You let me walk into that blind." Eleanor flinched. "I know, and I'm sorry. I didn't know it was him at first. By the time I did, everything was already moving." Daniel exhaled sharply, trying to rein himself in. "Did you tell HR?" "Yes, eventually. They couldn't prove intent. So you paid the price instead." Eleanor nodded once. "I chose to leave." Silence filled the space between them. Daniel looked at her, really looked. Not as a boss. Not as a complication. As a woman who had lost control of a narrative and decided to walk away rather than let it rot her from the inside. "You could have told me," he said. "I was afraid," she replied simply. "Afraid you'd think I used you. Or that you'd be dragged further into it." Daniel stared down at his coffee. "I don't have room for chaos," he said quietly. "I have a son." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I waited." That word hung between them. Waited. Daniel stood up slowly. "I need time. I understand." As he walked out, Daniel felt the ground beneath his carefully managed life shift again. Not collapse, but tilt. Because now he knew the truth. And knowing it meant he could no longer pretend that walking away would make everything settle back into place. Daniel thought the truth would bring relief. Instead, it followed him. It sat in the passenger seat as he drove home, quiet and heavy. It lingered while he reheated leftovers and listened to Caleb talk about a classmate who kept chewing pencils. It crept in later, when the house went still and Daniel lay awake on the couch, staring at the dark ceiling. The complaint hadn't just been gossip. It had been strategy. That realization changed things. It reframed the sideways looks at work, the stalled opportunities, the careful distance people kept. None of it had been accidental. Someone had pushed the first domino on purpose. Daniel didn't like feeling played. The next morning, he woke with a tension headache and the uncomfortable certainty that pretending nothing had happened was no longer an option. He moved through his routine anyway. Breakfast, backpack, bus stop. The sky was low and gray, threatening snow. "Dad?" Caleb asked as they waited. "Yeah. You ever get that feeling like something's about to happen?" Daniel glanced at him. "What kind of something?" Caleb shrugged. "Good or bad?" "Just something." Daniel considered that. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes." Caleb nodded, satisfied, as if that answer completed a thought. At work, the warehouse felt different again. Not hostile. Just watchful. A new interim director had been announced. Someone from corporate, temporary, unfamiliar. People speculated openly now that Eleanor was gone. Her name came up often, usually followed by lowered voices. Daniel kept his head down. Near the end of the shift, HR emailed him. "We'd like to close out a few remaining questions related to the previous inquiry. Please stop by tomorrow morning." Daniel stared at the screen, jaw tightening. At home that night, he packed Caleb's lunch and stared at the fridge longer than necessary. He thought about calling Eleanor. About asking what she hadn't said the first time. About telling her HR was circling again. He didn't. Some lines, once crossed, demanded clarity. And Daniel wasn't sure yet where he wanted to stand. The HR meeting the next morning was brief but unsettling. Different tone. Fewer formalities. "We're reviewing documentation that surfaced late in the process," the representative said. "Nothing accusatory. Just procedural." "Documentation from where?" Daniel asked. The representative hesitated. "External sources." Daniel understood immediately. Afterward, Daniel sat in his car gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. External sources meant the ex-husband. It meant this wasn't finished. That afternoon, Eleanor called him. "I heard HR reached out again," she said without preamble. Daniel closed his eyes. "How?" "Because he's still pushing," she replied. "He doesn't like losing." Daniel's voice stayed calm, but his chest burned. "What does he want?" "Control," Eleanor said. "And distraction." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I won't let this touch my son." "I know," she said. "That's why I need to tell you something else." Daniel straightened. "What now?" Eleanor paused. "He knows where you work. He knows your name. And he knows I care whether you're okay." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Is he dangerous?" Daniel asked. "No," she said quickly. "Not violent. Just vindictive." Daniel said nothing, absorbing that. "I'm telling you because I won't let this unfold without your consent," Eleanor continued. "If you want distance, I'll keep it." Daniel looked out at the warehouse floor through his windshield. Forklifts moving in neat lines. People doing their jobs, unaware. "I don't run," Daniel said finally. "But I don't rush either." "I wouldn't ask you to," Eleanor replied. That evening, Daniel sat with Caleb on the couch, helping him study for a spelling test. Caleb leaned against him, warm and solid. "You're distracted again," Caleb said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me," Caleb replied. Daniel wrapped an arm around him, holding on a second longer than usual. Later, after Caleb was asleep, Daniel checked his phone. A new message sat waiting. "We need to talk. Face to face. No name. Unknown number." Daniel stared at the screen, pulse quickening. He didn't know how the number had found him, but he knew who it was. And he knew that whatever came next would force him to choose between staying silent to protect his peace or stepping forward to protect the truth. Daniel didn't reply to the message right away. He set the phone face down on the counter like it might buzz again if he stared too long. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. The house smelled faintly of dish soap and the cinnamon candle Caleb insisted on lighting every night. Everything felt normal. Too normal. He waited until Caleb was asleep before picking the phone back up. The message was still there. No follow-up. No explanation. "We need to talk. Face to face." Daniel typed, deleted, typed again. "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "You know who it is." Daniel exhaled through his nose. Of course he did. He didn't respond again. Not that night. Sleep came in pieces. Short stretches broken by old memories he didn't invite. His late wife's laugh in the kitchen. Hospital hallways that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Signing papers with shaking hands. Learning how to tie a tie one-handed while holding a crying toddler on his hip. By morning, the decision had already been made, even if he hadn't said it out loud. He would meet him. Not for answers. Not for peace. For boundaries. Daniel dropped Caleb at school, lingering a moment longer than usual as Caleb slung his backpack over one shoulder. "You're picking me up today, right?" Caleb asked. "Always," Daniel said. Caleb smiled and ran off, boots slapping against the pavement. Daniel watched until the doors closed. Then he texted the number. "Where?" The reply came slower this time. "Coffee place on Grant." No. Daniel knew the one. Neutral ground. Public. Strategic. The hours crawled. At work, he moved through tasks on autopilot. The interim director nodded at him once, unreadable. HR didn't call. No emails. The waiting felt intentional, like someone holding a breath. At 11:45, Daniel clocked out and drove. The coffee shop was busy but not loud. Low music. Steam hissing. People hunched over laptops pretending not to listen to other people's conversations. He spotted the man immediately. Tall. Well-dressed. Calm in a way that felt rehearsed. The ex-husband stood when he saw Daniel approach. "Daniel," he said, smiling like they were old acquaintances. "Thanks for coming." "Sit down," Daniel replied, already pulling out the chair. They sat. Up close, the man looked tired in a polished way. Sleepless eyes hidden behind control. His wedding ring was gone. I didn't expect you to respond, the man said. I didn't expect you to contact me, Daniel replied. The man shrugged. Life surprises us. Daniel didn't smile. I won't waste your time, the man continued. I know you've been in touch with Eleanor. Daniel said nothing. I also know HR reopened your file, the man added casually. Daniel's jaw tightened. If you're trying to intimidate me, you're doing a poor job. The man chuckled. Not intimidation. Leverage. Daniel leaned back. Say what you want. The man folded his hands. I want you to stop seeing her. Daniel stared at him. That's it. For now. You don't get to decide that. The man's smile faded slightly. I get to influence it. Daniel leaned forward. Listen carefully. You involved my job. You involved my family. That ends now. The man's eyes flickered. Your family? My son, Daniel said evenly. Silence stretched between them. I did my research, the man said finally. Single father. Clean record. Dependable. People like you. Daniel held his gaze. Then you should know I don't scare easily. The man sighed as if disappointed. You don't understand how this works. Daniel stood. I understand enough. As he turned to leave, the man spoke again. Ask Eleanor why she really left, he said softly. She didn't tell you everything. Daniel froze. He didn't turn back. He walked out into the cold air, heart pounding, the words echoing louder with every step. Because deep down Daniel already knew. There was more. And whatever Eleanor hadn't said yet, was about to matter. Daniel didn't drive home right away. He sat in the parking lot with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing in particular. The cold crept through the windshield. His breath fogged the glass, then disappeared. The words followed him anyway. Ask Eleanor why she really left. He replayed the coffee shop moment in his head over and over. The man's tone. Not angry. Not desperate. Almost relieved. Like he'd passed along a burden. Daniel finally started the car when his phone buzzed. Eleanor. He let it ring twice before answering. Hey, she said. Her voice sounded normal. Warm. That somehow made it worse. Hey, he replied. You okay? She asked. You left the office kind of fast earlier. I needed air, Daniel said. We should talk. There was a pause. Just long enough to notice. About? She asked. Tonight, he said. After Caleb's asleep. Another pause. Longer this time. Okay, Eleanor said quietly. I'll come by. Daniel ended the call and sat there a moment longer, heart thudding. He didn't know what he expected, denial, excuses, anger, but the silence on the other end had told him plenty. She already knew what was coming. That evening, Caleb ate dinner sprawled across the living room floor, homework half done, asking questions about planets and whether dogs could dream. Daniel answered automatically, smiling when appropriate, laughing when Caleb did. He tucked him in, stayed an extra minute, brushed hair from his forehead. You're thinking too loud, Caleb said sleepily. Daniel smiled. Go to sleep. The door clicked shut. At 7:30, Eleanor knocked. She stood there in a wool coat, hair loose, hands clasped like she didn't know where to put them. When Daniel stepped aside to let her in, she didn't meet his eyes. They sat at the kitchen table. The same place where they'd shared takeout, laughed over burnt coffee, talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. Daniel didn't ease into it. I met your ex-husband today, he said. Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. He reached out, Daniel continued. He asked me to stop seeing you. He hinted at my job. And then he told me you didn't tell me everything. Eleanor closed her eyes. Daniel waited. He didn't interrupt the silence this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but thin. I didn't leave because of one fight, she said. Or even a bad year. Daniel said nothing. I left because I was afraid, she continued. And because I did something I thought I could live with, until I couldn't. Daniel leaned back slowly. What did you do? She looked up then, eyes glassy but defiant. I covered something up. The words landed heavier than he expected. At work? Daniel asked. Yes. Daniel's mind raced. Policies. Audits. Her position. The pressure she'd mentioned in passing but never explained. He was involved, Eleanor said as if reading his thoughts. Not directly. But he knew. He always knew. Why? Daniel asked. Why cover it up? Eleanor swallowed. Because if I didn't, dozens of people would have lost their jobs. People who didn't do anything wrong. The board wanted a scapegoat. I gave them silence instead. Daniel exhaled slowly. And your marriage? She laughed bitterly. Collapsed under the weight of secrets. Daniel looked down at the table. The grain in the wood blurred for a moment. So why tell me now? He asked. Because he's not done, Eleanor said. And because you deserve to know what you're standing near. Daniel stood and paced once across the kitchen. You should have told me earlier, he said. I know. He stopped in front of her. Is this going to blow back on me? On Caleb? Eleanor shook her head quickly. No. I wouldn't let that happen. You can't control that, Daniel said quietly. Silence settled again. Finally, Eleanor spoke. If you want to walk away, I'll understand. Daniel studied her face. The strength. The fear. The honesty that came too late but still mattered. I don't know what I want, he said. But I know I don't like being pushed. Eleanor nodded. Neither do I. Daniel glanced toward the hallway where Caleb slept. What happens if this comes out? He asked. Eleanor hesitated. That, she said softly, depends on how far he's willing to go. Daniel felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Because for the first time this wasn't just about love. It was about consequences. Daniel woke before the alarm. The house was quiet in that early hollow way, like it was holding its breath. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying Eleanor's words until they lost shape. Covered something up. Dozens of jobs. A board looking for a scapegoat. A man who wasn't finished. By the time the alarm finally buzzed, Daniel was already tired. Caleb shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, hoodie half-zipped. Daniel poured cereal, burned the toast slightly, apologized without explaining. Caleb didn't press. He sensed when questions would land wrong. You coming to the winter assembly today? Caleb asked, spoon clinking. Daniel froze for half a second. Yeah, I'll be there. Caleb nodded, satisfied. Good. After the school drop-off, Daniel sat in the car again, hands on the wheel, engine running. He told himself not to spiral. He had work. A kid depending on him. A life that required steadiness. But the message waiting on his phone shattered that illusion. We need documents. Come by HR. No explanation. No context. Just that. The hallway outside HR smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. The same neutral art on the walls. The same polite smiles that meant nothing. Inside the office sat two people Daniel recognized and one he didn't. A woman in a gray blazer introduced herself as legal counsel. Her voice was calm, almost friendly. We're conducting a routine internal review, she said. Your name came up tangentially. Daniel felt his pulse in his throat. Tangentially how? She slid a folder across the table. You were assigned to transport a senior executive on the night of the holiday party. Daniel stared at the folder. That wasn't official. Nevertheless, she said, we need a statement. Daniel leaned back slowly. Am I in trouble? The woman smiled faintly. Not at this time. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes of carefully worded questions. How much had Eleanor drank? Who saw them leave? Whether she appeared impaired. Whether Daniel had noticed anything unusual in her demeanor. Whether she'd said anything about work. Daniel answered truthfully. Carefully. When it was over, the interim director walked him out, hand heavy on Daniel's shoulder. You did the right thing that night, the man said quietly. Just keep your head down. Daniel nodded, but his stomach twisted. By the time he left the building, the sky had darkened. Snow threatened but didn't fall. His phone buzzed again. Eleanor, they talked to you, didn't they? Daniel didn't reply while driving. He picked Caleb up, sat through the winter assembly on a folding chair, clapped when expected. Watched his son sing slightly off-key, eyes scanning the audience until they found Daniel's. Caleb smiled brighter then. That smile anchored him. Later that night, after Caleb slept, Daniel finally texted back. Yes. The reply came instantly. I'm so sorry. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. What aren't you telling me? He typed. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Then his phone rang. I didn't think they'd move this fast, Eleanor said, her voice tight. I thought we had time. Time for what? Daniel asked. For me to fix it, she said. Before it touched you. Daniel exhaled sharply. You don't get to decide that. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you now. Telling me what? Daniel demanded. She hesitated. There's an audit trail, she said. One I altered. Daniel closed his eyes. Eleanor. I didn't fabricate numbers, she rushed. I delayed disclosures. Shifted timing. Enough to keep people employed while the board cleaned its hands. And now? Daniel asked. Now he wants immunity, she said. And he's willing to burn me to get it. Daniel's jaw tightened. And me? He thinks you're leverage, she said quietly. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, the weight of the house pressing in. Do you regret it? He asked. A long pause. No, Eleanor said. But I regret who gets hurt next. Daniel stared down the hallway toward Caleb's room again. What do you need from me? He asked. Eleanor swallowed. I need you to trust me. And I need you to be careful. Daniel laughed once, humorless. That's not an answer. I know, she said. But it's all I can ask for right now. They hung up without resolution. That night, Daniel lay awake listening to the house settle, every creak sounding louder than it should. He thought about choices. About lines you crossed thinking you understood the cost, only to realize later the bill kept growing. His phone buzzed again just after midnight. An unfamiliar number. If you care about your son, you'll tell Eleanor to cooperate. Daniel sat up, heart hammering. Because this time the threat wasn't implied. It was direct. The next morning, Daniel woke to a layer of frost on the car windshield and a sense of tension that had settled into his shoulders like an old coat. He didn't want to check his phone, but he did anyway. A string of texts awaited him from unknown numbers. One line each. Short. Menacing. Tell her to cooperate. Stop dragging your feet. Your son is watching. Daniel's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. He drove to work in silence, mind racing. Every stoplight, every pedestrian, every honk sounded like an alarm. The warehouse felt normal enough when he arrived, forklifts clanking, radios humming, colleagues moving through their routines. But he knew normal here was an illusion. He tried to focus on tasks, scanning inventory and checking shipments, but every shadow seemed a little too dark, every glance from a coworker a little too long. By mid-morning, he realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to contact Eleanor. Her voice was calm when he called, but her eyes, when he caught her in the cafe later, told a different story. She had been waiting just like him, knowing the threat was real. They've escalated, she said quietly. The board. My ex. Both. They're using everything they can. Documents, witnesses, emails. They think I'll fold. Daniel studied her face. Her cheeks were pale, her hands tight around her coffee cup. And if you don't? He asked. They'll make me the scapegoat, she admitted. And you? They'll try to pin something on you too. It's leverage. Daniel exhaled, letting the tension in his shoulders ease fractionally. Then we don't give them the satisfaction, he said. We control what they can touch. Eleanor nodded slowly, relief flickering, but worry still etched into her eyes. They spent the next hour plotting discreetly. Every move had to be calculated. Every communication controlled. Daniel felt the old exhaustion return, the one that had haunted him through sleepless nights and endless paperwork. But there was something different now, a sharp clarity. Later, Daniel drove home through the gray streets, snow beginning to fall softly. Each flake seemed to press against him, a quiet reminder that the world outside the warehouse wasn't going to wait for him to feel ready. At home, Caleb bounded into the kitchen with the energy only a 10-year-old could muster in a storm. Dad, can we build a snow fort? Daniel managed a small smile. We'll see after dinner. While Caleb ate, Daniel stood by the window watching snow settle on the roof of the neighboring house. He thought of Eleanor, her courage, and the secrets she'd carried alone. And then he thought of his son. The weight of responsibility pressed harder than ever. That night, after Caleb slept, Daniel and Eleanor met at the small cafe they had claimed as neutral ground. This time it was less about explanations and more about preparation. Papers were exchanged, notes scribbled, emails saved and hidden. They rehearsed their responses, anticipated questions, and strengthened each other's resolve. Eleanor sipped her coffee and looked out the window at the falling snow. "We have to trust each other," she said. Daniel nodded. "We do. For Caleb. And for us." The world outside carried on in its usual chaos, but inside the cafe, the two of them built a fragile sanctuary. It was the calm before a storm Daniel already knew was coming. And for the first time he realized that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. As he drove home, snowflakes melting on his windshield, his phone buzzed. "Unknown number. We know what you're planning." Daniel's jaw clenched. He gripped the wheel, heart hammering. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. And this time it wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. Daniel didn't answer the message. He turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove the rest of the way home with both hands locked on the steering wheel. Snow came down harder now, blurring the street lights into pale halos. Every passing car felt closer than it should have been. At home, he double-checked the locks before even taking his coat off. Caleb was already asleep, sprawled sideways across the bed, one sock missing. Daniel stood in the doorway longer than usual, listening to his son breathe. Slow. Even. Safe. For now. Daniel closed the door quietly and leaned his forehead against the wall. The next day brought a different kind of pressure. Subtle. Professional. The kind that wore a suit and smiled. At work, Daniel was pulled into another meeting. Same legal counsel. Different tone. "We're just tying loose ends," the woman said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "We noticed discrepancies in time logs related to the holiday event." Daniel read it once. Then again. They weren't accusing him. Not yet. But they were laying groundwork. "I logged exactly what happened," Daniel said. "I'm sure you did," she replied. "But perception matters." Daniel looked up. "To who?" She smiled politely. "To anyone reviewing the narrative." That word stuck with him. Narrative. By lunchtime, Daniel's phone buzzed again. "Eleanor." He contacted my attorney. Daniel stepped outside into the cold to call her. "He's pushing for a deal," Eleanor said. "Full immunity for himself. He's offering documents in exchange." "Real ones?" Daniel asked. "Yes," she said. "Enough to prove the board orchestrated the cover-up." Daniel leaned against the brick wall, breath clouding. "Then why hasn't he turned them in?" "Because he wants control," Eleanor said. "And leverage." Daniel closed his eyes. "Which is me." "And Caleb," she said softly. Silence stretched. "I won't let him near my son," Daniel said. "I know," Eleanor replied. "That's why we need to move first." They met that evening in Eleanor's apartment. No cafe. No public buffer. The air inside felt heavier, charged with risk. Eleanor spread files across the dining table. Printouts. Flash drives. Old emails. Meeting minutes that had been quietly revised months earlier. "I kept copies," she said. "I didn't trust him. Or them." Daniel flipped through the papers slowly. "This is enough to bury people." "Yes," she said. "Including me." Daniel looked at her. "Why didn't you destroy this?" Eleanor met his gaze. "Because I needed proof that I wasn't crazy. That what I did mattered." Daniel nodded. He understood that feeling too well. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Eleanor didn't move. Neither did Daniel. The knock came again. Firmer. Daniel stepped toward the door, heart pounding. He checked the peephole. A woman stood there, mid-40s, plain coat, badge already in hand. "Miss Grant?" the woman called. "Internal Affairs." Eleanor inhaled sharply behind him. Daniel opened the door partway. "Yes," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "We need to ask you a few questions," the woman said. "May we come in?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. The interview lasted over an hour. Calm questions. Measured pauses. The agent took notes, asked for clarification, asked again. Daniel stayed silent and less addressed. He watched Eleanor closely. The way she chose words carefully. The way she never lied but never offered more than asked. When it was over, the agent stood. "This isn't an arrest," she said. "But it is active." After the door closed, Eleanor sagged into a chair. "They're circling," she said. Daniel rubbed his face. "So is he." As if summoned, Daniel's phone buzzed. Unknown number. "You should have stayed out of it." Daniel stared at the screen. Then another message. "This is your last warning." Daniel looked up at Eleanor. "We can't keep reacting." She nodded slowly. "Then we don't." That night, Daniel drove home later than usual. Halfway down his street, his headlights caught something off. A car he didn't recognize. Parked 2 houses down. Engine running. Lights off. Daniel slowed, heart thudding. As he pulled into his driveway, the other car rolled forward slightly. Just enough to let him know it was intentional. Daniel stayed in his seat, watching the silhouette behind the wheel. The car didn't follow him. But it didn't leave either. And in that moment, Daniel understood something clearly. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about how far someone was willing to go. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside the house felt amplified. A passing car. Wind scraping branches against the siding. The soft hum of the refrigerator cycling on and off. He checked the front window twice, then a third time, careful not to let the blinds move too much. The car was gone by morning. That didn't make him feel better. After dropping Caleb at school, Daniel didn't go straight to work. He drove 3 blocks past his usual turn, parked near a row of townhouses, and sat there watching his mirrors. Nothing happened. No one followed. No sudden knocks. Just the quiet hum of normal life continuing without him. It felt intentional. At work, the pressure sharpened. The interim director avoided eye contact. 2 co-workers who usually joked with him went strangely quiet when he walked into the break room. HR sent another request for clarification, this time asking him to resubmit a written statement for consistency. Daniel typed slowly, carefully. He stuck to facts, times, actions. No speculation. Still, when he hit send, his stomach tightened. Around mid-afternoon, Eleanor texted. "They froze my access." Daniel stepped outside to call her. "They locked me out of systems," she said. "Email, files, everything." "That's retaliation," Daniel said. "Not officially," she replied. "They're calling it protocol." Daniel leaned against the building, cold seeping through his jacket. "What about the copies you kept?" "I still have them," she said. "And I spoke to an attorney this morning." Quietly, Daniel closed his eyes. "What did they say?" "That if we move first, we have a chance," she said. "If we wait, we'll be buried." Daniel thought of Caleb. Of the car parked down the street. Of the text that mentioned his son without naming him. "We move," Daniel said. "But carefully." That evening, Daniel picked Caleb up early and took him out for burgers. It wasn't planned. It wasn't necessary. But Daniel needed the normalcy like oxygen. Caleb talked about school, about a kid who cheated at kickball, about a science project involving magnets. Daniel listened, laughed at the right moments, memorized the way ketchup smeared at the corner of Caleb's mouth. "You're quiet today," Caleb said, tilting his head. Daniel smiled. "Just tired." Caleb nodded, accepting it without suspicion. Kids always knew more than they let on, but they also trusted deeply. At home, after Caleb fell asleep, Daniel packed a small overnight bag. Just essentials. Clothes. Documents. He didn't know why, only that something inside him insisted. His phone buzzed as he zipped the bag. "Eleanor. My ex wants to meet." Daniel didn't hesitate. "Where?" "Same place. Grant Street Cafe. Tomorrow morning." Daniel stared at the message. "Don't go alone," he typed. "I won't," she replied. "My attorney will be nearby." Daniel wasn't reassured. The next morning, Daniel dropped Caleb off with explicit instructions to call him if anything felt off. Caleb rolled his eyes but promised. Daniel didn't attend the meeting. He waited instead, parked across the street, watching the cafe through fogged glass. He saw Eleanor arrive. Composed. He saw the man follow minutes later, moving like he owned the sidewalk. They sat, talked, gestured. Daniel couldn't hear a word, but he saw enough. When Eleanor stood abruptly, Daniel tensed. She didn't storm out. She walked away slowly, shoulders squared. The man stayed seated. Then he looked up, directly at Daniel. Even through the windshield, the eye contact felt deliberate, challenging. The man lifted his coffee cup slightly. A mock toast. Daniel's phone buzzed. Eleanor. He offered me a deal. Daniel typed back. What kind? One that protects him. Sacrifices others. Daniel's jaw clenched. And you? Several minutes passed before her reply came. He thinks I'll take it. He thinks fear will make me practical. Daniel watched as the man exited the cafe, strolling away without a glance back. What do you think? Daniel typed. Eleanor's response was immediate. I think he underestimated how tired I am of being cornered. Daniel exhaled slowly. That night, Daniel received an email forwarded from Eleanor's attorney. A formal notice. Whistleblower protections. Conditional immunity discussions. The first official move on the board. Daniel felt something shift. Hope maybe. Or danger tightening its grip. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You're making a mistake. Daniel stared at the screen, then typed back for the first time. So are you. The reply didn't come. But Daniel knew better than to think that meant silence. Just meant the game had changed. The fallout didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments. An email copied too widely. A calendar invite canceled without explanation. A meeting that used to include Eleanor now going on without her name anywhere near it. The silence around her grew louder by the hour. Daniel felt it too. At work, his access badge stalled at the gate for half a second longer than usual. Long enough to notice. Long enough to send a message. He kept his head down, but he listened more closely. Watched body language. Paid attention to who stopped talking when he entered a room and who suddenly wanted to talk too much. Pressure had a way of revealing motives. Midweek, Eleanor called him from her car. They're accelerating, she said. The board called an emergency session. Closed door. Daniel leaned against his truck, eyes on the gray sky. About you? About me, she confirmed. And about collateral exposure. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's me. Yes, she said. And anyone else they can reach. Daniel thought of Caleb's school. The pickup line. The teachers who recognized him. The routines that made life feel safe because they were predictable. They won't come near my son, Daniel said. They already have, Eleanor replied quietly. Daniel straightened. What do you mean? They asked for records, she said. Public ones. School enrollment verification. Emergency contacts. Daniel's chest tightened. That's not legal. They didn't cross a legal line, she said. They walked right up to it and smiled. Daniel closed his eyes. Okay. Then we changed the rules. That night, Daniel sat Caleb down at the kitchen table. Hey, he said gently. If anyone ever asks you questions about me, about work, about where we go, what do you do? Caleb frowned. Like strangers? Anyone, Daniel said. Even someone who says they're helping. Caleb thought about it. I tell you. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Caleb studied his face. Are we in trouble? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. No. But we're being careful. Caleb accepted that because that was what kids did when they trusted you. The next day, Eleanor sent Daniel a document marked confidential. It wasn't financial. It was personal. A timeline. Dates. Messages. Notes she'd kept quietly during the final years of her marriage. Patterns of pressure. Subtle coercion. Threats disguised as concern. Instances where her ex had positioned himself as a protector while quietly tightening the cage. Daniel read it twice. This isn't just corporate, he said when he called her. This is abuse. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I didn't have language for it then. You do now, Daniel said. So does my attorney, she replied. That changed things. By Friday, Internal Affairs requested a second interview. This time they asked Eleanor about her marriage, about influence, about decision-making under pressure. Someone had finally asked the right questions. Daniel waited in the lobby while Eleanor spoke. The minutes stretched. People walked past him carrying coffee, chatting about weekend plans, unaware of how close everything felt to cracking open. When Eleanor emerged, her face was pale but steady. "They're listening," she said. "Finally." Daniel exhaled. "Good." But relief didn't last long. That evening, as Daniel pulled into the school parking lot, he noticed a man standing near the fence. Well-dressed. Too still. Watching. Daniel slowed, heart thudding. The man didn't approach. Didn't speak. He simply raised his phone and took a photo. Daniel stepped out of the car. "Hey." The man turned and walked away calmly, disappearing between parked vehicles. Caleb ran toward Daniel moments later, backpack bouncing. "Dad?" he called. Daniel forced a smile, scanning the lot. "You okay?" Caleb asked. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Let's go." That night, Daniel called Eleanor. "They photographed Caleb," he said. Eleanor's breath caught. "That's escalation." "Yes," Daniel said. "And it ends now." They met late, neither wanting to risk being overheard during daylight. Eleanor's attorney joined them this time, calm and unflinching. "We stop reacting," the attorney said. "We file. We document. We go public if necessary." Daniel leaned forward. "What about my son?" "We protect him," the attorney said. "And we make it very clear that any contact with a minor changes this from corporate misconduct to something much worse." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. Daniel reached across the table and steadied them. When Daniel got home, he installed a new security camera over the front door. Another in the backyard. He hated the necessity of it. As he finished, his phone buzzed. A known number. "You don't know who you're fighting." Daniel typed back slowly. "You're about to find out." The response didn't come. But Daniel stood there in the quiet house, aware of something shifting again. This wasn't just exposure anymore. It was retaliation. And retaliation meant desperation. The first article didn't mention Eleanor's name. It didn't need to. Daniel saw it on his phone while standing in the school pickup line, the headline sliding across his screen like a warning flare. "Senior executives under review after internal compliance complaint." No photos. No details. Just enough to start people asking questions. By the time Caleb climbed into the passenger seat, Daniel's phone had buzzed 3 more times. Eleanor. Her attorney. An unknown number he didn't open. "Everything okay?" Caleb asked, buckling his seatbelt. "Yeah," Daniel said, forcing his voice to stay light. "Just work stuff." Caleb nodded and launched into a story about a substitute teacher who couldn't control the class. Daniel listened, laughed at the right moments, but his mind stayed elsewhere. Public attention changed rules. It made people reckless. Or careful. Sometimes both. That evening, Eleanor called him before he even had a chance to check the cameras. "They leaked," she said. "Strategically?" Daniel asked. "Yes," she replied. "Not enough to expose everything. Just enough to test the waters." Daniel leaned against the counter, watching the live feed on his tablet. Empty street. Stillness that felt staged. "Your ex?" Daniel asked. "He denies it," Eleanor said. "Which means it was either him, or the board testing loyalty." Daniel exhaled. "Either way it escalates." "Already has," Eleanor said. Internal Affairs requested subpoenas. That caught Daniel's attention. Subpoenas for who? For emails, devices, personal accounts. Daniel closed his eyes. "Including yours?" "Yes." "And mine?" he asked. Possibly. Daniel didn't react right away. He'd expected this. Still, expectation didn't make it easier. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I know," Eleanor replied. "But truth doesn't always protect first. Sometimes it protects last." That night, Daniel stayed up later than usual, backing up files, printing messages, organizing timelines the way Eleanor had taught him to. He hated how natural it felt. like preparing for impact. Around midnight, the front door camera alerted. Daniel froze. A figure stood on the porch, but up, face angled down. Not knocking, just waiting. Daniel watched the feed, heart pounding. After 30 seconds, the person placed an envelope on the welcome mat and walked away. Daniel waited a full minute before opening the door. The envelope was unmarked. Inside was a single printed photo. Caleb. In the school parking lot. Taken from behind the fence. Daniel's hands shook. On the back, a message written in neat block letters. Last chance. Daniel didn't sleep. The next morning, Eleanor came over early. One look at his face and she knew. They came to your house, she said quietly. Yes, Daniel replied. And they crossed a line. Eleanor's jaw tightened. I'm done protecting them. They sat at the table, coffee untouched. My attorney says we can go public now, Eleanor said. Names? Details. The whole thing. Daniel nodded slowly. Then we don't half-step. By noon, a second article dropped. This one sharper. Specific. Names included. Eleanor's, yes, but also the board members. Patterns of intimidation. Documented retaliation. The response was immediate. Phones rang nonstop. Emails flooded in. Some supportive. Some threatening. Eleanor turned her phone off completely. Daniel picked Caleb up early and took him straight home. You're not going to school tomorrow? Daniel said gently. Caleb frowned. Am I sick? No, Daniel said. We're just taking a day. Caleb accepted it, though curiosity lingered in his eyes. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Daniel's phone rang. Private number. He answered without greeting. You've made this very public, the voice said. Come. Controlled. You made it personal, Daniel replied. Pause. You think exposure gives you protection. I think threats don't work on me, Daniel said. The voice sighed softly. You're not the only one with something to lose. Daniel's grip tightened. You mention my son again and this conversation ends very differently. Another pause. Longer. We can still contain this, the voice said. Walk away. Convince her to settle. Daniel laughed once. You still don't understand. Help me understand, the voice replied coolly. Daniel lowered his voice. You already lost. The line went dead. Daniel stood in the quiet kitchen, snow tapping against the window, heart racing. He didn't feel victorious. He felt hunted. His tablet buzzed with a security alert. Motion detected. Backyard. Daniel moved to the window slowly, carefully pulling the curtain aside. A figure stood near the fence, partially obscured by falling snow. Watching the house. Not hiding anymore. And this time they weren't leaving a warning. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't rush the door or grab a weapon he didn't own. He stood very still, breath shallow, eyes locked on the tablet screen. The backyard camera shook slightly in the wind, snow streaking across the frame, but the figure was clear enough. Tall. Deliberate. Not pacing. Not sneaking. Waiting. Daniel muted the tablet and walked down the hallway, every step measured. Caleb was in his room, headphones on, playing a game, laughter muffled through the door. Daniel paused there for half a second, grounding himself in the sound. Then he stepped into his bedroom and pulled open the drawer beneath the bed. Inside was a small metal lockbox. He hadn't touched it in years. He opened it and took out his late wife's old phone. No SIM card. No service. But the photos were still there. Dates. Locations. Metadata intact. She'd been meticulous. Daniel had kept it for sentimental reasons. Now it felt like insurance. Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket and dialed Eleanor. They're in my yard, he said quietly. What? Her voice sharpened instantly. Are you calling the police? Not yet, Daniel said. They want me scared, not loud. Daniel, that's not. I know, he interrupted gently. Just listen. This feels different. Different how? They're not hiding anymore. Silence, then. I'm calling my attorney. Good, Daniel said. And Eleanor, whatever happens next, you don't pull back. I won't, she said. I promise. Daniel hung up and watched the feed again. The figure shifted slightly, then lifted a phone. The faint glow of the screen lit their face just enough for Daniel to see it wasn't a stranger. He recognized him. The ex-husband. The man didn't wave, didn't smile. He simply raised the phone and took another photo. That was the moment Daniel snapped. He opened the back door and stepped outside into the cold. Snow crunched under his boots, loud in the quiet night. The man looked up slowly, unsurprised. "You should leave," Daniel said evenly. The man smiled, thin and controlled. "You invited this." "You're trespassing," Daniel replied. "And you're being recorded." The man glanced toward the camera, unconcerned. "Good." Daniel's pulse hammered. "You photograph my son again and I call the police. I release everything. Tonight." The man studied him for a long moment. "You won't." Daniel pulled the old phone from his pocket. "This contains metadata from years ago. Before your name was clean. Before hers was dirty. I kept it because I loved my wife. Turns out she loved evidence." The man's expression flickered. "Just for a second." "There it is," Daniel said softly. "That look." "You don't know what you're holding," the man said. "I know exactly what I'm holding," Daniel replied. "And I know what you're afraid of." Snow fell between them, quiet witnesses. The man took a step back. Then another. "This isn't over," he said. Daniel nodded. "No. But it's changed." The man turned and disappeared through the gate, boots crunching until the sound faded. Daniel stood there long after, cold biting through his jacket until his phone buzzed. "Eleanor. Internal Affairs just issued warrants." Daniel exhaled shakily. Inside, Caleb called out, "Dad?" Daniel went back in, locking the door behind him. "Yeah," he said, forcing steadiness. "I'm here." Later that night, as sirens echoed faintly somewhere across the city, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the lockbox open, documents spread out, memories turning into proof. For the first time in weeks, the fear loosened its grip. Not because the danger was gone, but because it was finally visible. And visible things could be confronted. Daniel's phone buzzed one last time before dawn. A known number. "You've made a powerful enemy." Daniel typed back without hesitation. "You made yourself one." Outside, the snow kept falling. Quiet. Relentless. Unforgiving. And somewhere in that white silence, the balance finally began to tip. Daniel didn't wait for the knock. He stepped onto the porch before the figure could reach the door, cold air slicing into his lungs. The streetlight cast long shadows, stretching the moment thin. Eleanor stood just inside behind him, phone already in hand, her attorney on the line. The man stopped at the edge of the walkway. Up close, he looked smaller than Daniel remembered. Not weaker. Just exposed. The polish had cracked. The confidence leaned too hard on control. "You really don't know when to stop," the man said. Daniel's voice stayed level. "This ends tonight." The man's mouth twitched. "You think federal interest scares me?" "No," Daniel said. "I think you're scared already." The man laughed softly. "You walked into this thinking you were a hero. You're collateral. Always were." Daniel stepped forward one pace. "You threatened my child." The laughter stopped. Sirens wailed somewhere distant. Not close enough to intervene. Close enough to be felt. "You should leave," Daniel said again. "While you still can." The man glanced past him toward the doorway. Toward Eleanor. "You," he said to her, voice sharpening. "You could have been protected. You chose noise instead." Eleanor stepped beside Daniel, shoulders squared. "I chose truth." The man's eyes hardened. "Truth is expensive." "So is silence," Daniel replied. For a moment it felt like time stalled. Snow crunched under a passing car. A porch light flicked on two houses down. Somewhere a dog barked. Then the man reached into his coat. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Daniel didn't move. The man pulled out a phone. He held it up, screen glowing. "One call," he said. "I can still frame this as a misunderstanding. Make it stop." Daniel shook his head. "You don't get to negotiate anymore." The man's jaw clenched. He looked past Daniel again at the house. At the cameras. At the quiet that no longer belonged to him. Red and blue lights finally reflected faintly off parked cars. The man exhaled through his nose. Long, controlled. Defeated in a way that still tried to look intentional. "This isn't over," he said almost to himself. Daniel met his eyes. "It is for us." The man turned away just as two patrol cars rounded the corner. Officers stepped out, voices calm, authoritative. Hands visible. Commands clear. The man didn't resist. As he was led to the curb, he looked back once more. Not at Eleanor. At Daniel. And for the first time there was no threat in his eyes. Only calculation. After the officers left, statements taken and assurances given, the street fell quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that followed something breaking. Inside, Eleanor sank onto the couch, covering her face. "It's really happening," she whispered. Daniel sat beside her. "Yeah." Weeks passed. The case expanded. Federal investigations widened. Names surfaced that surprised no one and a few that surprised everyone. Eleanor testified. Carefully. Honestly. Without embellishment. Daniel gave his statement once. Then again. Each time steadier. At work, the interim director was replaced. HR sent an apology that felt more legal than human, but the pressure eased. The looks changed. No longer suspicious. Curious. Respectful. Some even grateful. One afternoon, Daniel picked Caleb up from school and found him grinning. "We learned about whistleblowers today," Caleb said. "People who tell the truth even when it's hard." Daniel swallowed. "Yeah." Caleb nodded. "They're kind of brave." Daniel smiled, eyes stinging. "They are." Eleanor's case didn't wrap up cleanly. It never could. She accepted responsibility where it belonged. She didn't pretend she'd been perfect. The outcome wasn't applause. It was integrity. Months later, on a quiet evening, Daniel and Eleanor sat on the back porch watching fireflies flicker in the yard. The cameras were still there, but they no longer felt like shields. Just reminders. "You ever think about how close we came to walking away?" Eleanor asked. Daniel nodded. "Every day." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for not." Daniel looked out at the yard, at the place where fear had once stood so boldly. "I didn't do it for courage," he said. "I did it because some things aren't negotiable." Eleanor smiled softly. Inside, Caleb laughed at something on TV, safe in the careless way children should be. Daniel breathed it in. The quiet. The ordinary. The earned peace. And if this story meant something to you, if you believe truth matters even when it's complicated, take a moment to support stories like this. Like the video. Subscribe. And if you want, share where you're watching from. Because real stories don't end when the danger passes. They end when someone chooses to stand. Daniel didn't wait for the knock. He stepped onto the porch before the figure could reach the door, cold air slicing into his lungs. The streetlight cast long shadows, stretching the moment thin. Eleanor stood just inside behind him, phone already in hand, her attorney on the line. The man stopped at the edge of the walkway. Up close, he looked smaller than Daniel remembered. Not weaker. Just exposed. The polish had cracked. The confidence leaned too hard on control. "You really don't know when to stop," the man said. Daniel's voice stayed level. "This ends tonight." The man's mouth twitched. "You think federal interest scares me?" "No," Daniel said. "I think you're scared already." The man laughed softly. "You walked into this thinking you were a hero. You're collateral. Always were." Daniel stepped forward one pace. "You threatened my child." The laughter stopped. Sirens wailed somewhere distant. Not close enough to intervene. Close enough to be felt. "You should leave," Daniel said again. "While you still can." The man glanced past him toward the doorway. Toward Eleanor. "You," he said to her, voice sharpening. "You could have been protected. You chose noise instead." Eleanor stepped beside Daniel, shoulders squared. "I chose truth." The man's eyes hardened. "Truth is expensive." "So is silence," Daniel replied. For a moment it felt like time stalled. Snow crunched under a passing car. A porch light flicked on two houses down. Somewhere a dog barked. Then the man reached into his coat. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Daniel didn't move. The man pulled out a phone. He held it up, screen glowing. "One call," he said. "I can still frame this as a misunderstanding. Make it stop." Daniel shook his head. "You don't get to negotiate anymore." The man's jaw clenched. He looked past Daniel again at the house, at the cameras, at the quiet that no longer belonged to him. Red and blue lights finally reflected faintly off parked cars. The man exhaled through his nose, long controlled, defeated in a way that still tried to look intentional. "This isn't over," he said almost to himself. Daniel met his eyes. "It is for us." The man turned away just as two patrol cars rounded the corner. Officers stepped out, voices calm, authoritative. Hands visible. Commands clear. The man didn't resist. As he was led to the curb, he looked back once more. Not at Eleanor. At Daniel. And for the first time there was no threat in his eyes. Only calculation. After the officers left, statements taken and assurances given, the street fell quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that followed something breaking. Inside, Eleanor sank onto the couch, covering her face. "It's really happening," she whispered. Daniel sat beside her. "Yeah." Weeks passed. The case expanded. Federal investigations widened. Names surfaced that surprised no one and a few that surprised everyone. Eleanor testified. Carefully. Honestly. Without embellishment. Daniel gave his statement once. Then again. Each time steadier. At work, the interim director was replaced. HR sent an apology that felt more legal than human, but the pressure eased. The looks changed. No longer suspicious. Curious. Respectful. Some even grateful. One afternoon, Daniel picked Caleb up from school and found him grinning. "We learned about whistleblowers today," Caleb said. "People who tell the truth even when it's hard." Daniel swallowed. "Yeah." Caleb nodded. "They're kind of brave." Daniel smiled, eyes stinging. "They are." Eleanor's case didn't wrap up cleanly. It never could. She accepted responsibility where it belonged. She didn't pretend she'd been perfect. The outcome wasn't applause. It was integrity. Months later, on a quiet evening, Daniel and Eleanor sat on the back porch watching fireflies flicker in the yard. The cameras were still there, but they no longer felt like shields. Just reminders. "You ever think about how close we came to walking away?" Eleanor asked. Daniel nodded. "Every day." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for not." Daniel looked out at the yard, at the place where fear had once stood so boldly. "I didn't do it for courage," he said. "I did it because some things aren't negotiable." Eleanor smiled softly. Inside, Caleb laughed at something on TV, safe in the careless way children should be. Daniel breathed it in. The quiet. The ordinary. The earned peace. And if this story meant something to you, if you believe truth matters even when it's complicated, take a moment to support stories like this. Like the video. Subscribe. And if you want, share where you're watching from. Because real stories don't end when the danger passes. They end when someone chooses to stand.